Good day to you, gentlemen. Today's talk is going to be a bit of a stream of consciousness. I want to talk about, for lack of a better word, sex, and my thoughts as they have evolved over the years concerning this strange and not so strange phenomenon that absolutely dominates all levels of human society in every respect. Now, most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about sex, and it's not the way you think I mean. Of course, people think about sex all the time. Almost all human behavior is motivated and driven by sex. And so they think about acquiring it. But very few people take the time to think about the nature of sex in a broad picture sense. So, whilst many people are motivated to acquire it, to engage in it, and think about it in terms of the stimulus they receive from it, they're not thinking about it on a meta level. But nothing else comes to mind when I'm trying to describe this phenomenon. So let's go way back in my life. I was 19, and I lost my virginity. And at the time, it was one of those, it was not a remarkable event for me. I'm sure many of you can confirm this. And I initially thought, was this the thing that everyone is talking about? Everyone is raging about, everyone is chasing after? This can't be that good. And I copulated with the same individual a few times thereafter. But it still wasn't truly amazing. It was okay. Then at age 20, I had my first so-called long-term relationship. And you probably know this story because I've talked about this female a number of times. She was the one with the gigantic gazonkas. And the combination of gigantic gazonkas and her just being an absolute fiend in bed completely entranced me. I was absolutely under her spell, so to speak. In the sense that I couldn't get enough of it. I was obsessed with boinking her. The best BJs I'd ever received. The best boinking. She was loud as hell. And on top of that, she could cook a mean meal. Now, I mention this because this particular female was really instrumental in many ways. Maybe the most important event of my life concerning interactions with females and the carnal. Because in my early 20s, I had a 3-year relationship with this woman. I was stuck with her. And apart from the things I mentioned, the gigantic zonkas, the unrelenting BJs, and the stuff that took place in the sheets, there wasn't very much else going on there. In fact, she was very aggressive, disagreeable, and sometimes even violent. And there were many incidents that would shed light upon this for me. A couple of examples were her throwing plates at me once, as well as utensils. Her getting so angry at me one time because I didn't take an interest in her clothing shopping that she hopped in the car, drove away, and left me stranded in a foreign city, as well as even worse stuff. And eventually I realized that the check I was cashing in here was not really worth it. Yes, the sex was extremely good, the best sex I ever had in my life, but I was paying a terrible price in every other department of my well-being, and my sense of peace of mind, all that was being violated on a very frequent basis. And so eventually I pulled the plug. She wouldn't accept that. In fact, she drove halfway across the country and nearly kicked in my door and tried to seduce me, and guess what? It worked. Another lesson to be learned. Eventually we entered into some sort of compromise between a relationship and a boink friendship, if you wish to call it that. And somehow, through magic, she got pregnant. Another lesson learned. I didn't really believe her. It was unclear at the time, and she used it to threaten me and claimed that if I didn't acquiesce, then she would invoke the full power of the law against me. And I called her bluff, because I think it was a bluff. And, according to her, she ended up getting an abortion. After this relationship with Gazanka Girl, it really changed fundamentally my perspective on sex. Not entirely, but there was a large shift in how I viewed it. I allowed myself to be entrapped in a quote-unquote toxic relationship, a very destructive relationship, simply because definitionally the sex was just so good. It was that good. It was utterly insane, and she was just open to whatever I wanted. And of course, that was probably a tool of manipulation, but it got me thinking. For the first time ever in my life, and I was still very young, I started to think about sex on a meta level. And I have to say, something about that entire 3-year encounter with that woman changed my views on sex permanently. And so after that point in time, although I did have relationships and dalliances with various females, I never found the sex particularly good. Now, part of that is just lack of compatibility and the fact that that particular female, the Gazanka girl, was just so good at it. But it really started me down a train of thought where I thought to myself, why am I doing this? I'm chasing after sex because people say I need to get laid. But when I engage in this action of copulation, frequently it's not very enjoyable. Frequently it feels like a chore, a task. And then further thoughts emerged, and I thought to myself, why am I actually doing this? Well, technically I'm trying to get my rocks off. Well, in many of these encounters I had to use a condom, and when I use condoms I feel virtually nothing. I don't think I've ever ejaculated in my life with a condom on. Maybe once. Maybe. But in any event, I never got my rocks off in those situations. And in general, it was always just very bland. I remember my late 20s. I was in a kind of boink dalliance friendship for about 3 to 4 weeks. And this female and I, we had nothing in common. Absolutely nothing. The sex was pretty bland, but I engaged in it because I thought, well, that's what I'm supposed to do, right? I remember one day boinking her, doggy style, with a condom on, and just being so bored that my mind started to drift elsewhere. I started thinking about video games. And in that moment, I couldn't care less. And I just told her I want to go home. A couple of days later, the saving grace, she apparently got to know some guy, and that became a serious thing. I wasn't really weeping bitter tears. There was nothing really in common between us. And throughout my late 20s and early 30s, I continued to have such dalliances, as well as a relationship or two. And something just happened. But I realized something very crucial, something that a lot of people don't want to acknowledge, that most sex isn't particularly good. And this isn't just my bias. I've talked to a lot of people, both men and women. Most sex is not particularly good. For men, and I guess I'm an oddball here, it's usually good enough, the whole pizza analogy. Pizza tastes good enough, even if it's not good pizza. But I realized in many cases, what I was trying to achieve was trying to get my rocks off, something I could just do by wanking off at home, much more quickly, much more efficiently, and then I could get on with my day. Because, gentlemen, you have to think about this from this perspective, and every one of you probably recognizes this, knows this feeling, now or in the past, when you get a kind of carnal sexual brain fog, and it simply needs to be alleviated. That is ultimately what most men are trying to achieve when they are pursuing women and attempting to have sex with them. They're simply trying to get their rocks off. They're not pursuing a higher purpose. Now, of course, in some sense, they're trying to, quote-unquote, reproduce. That's the ultimate purpose behind it. We're not talking proximately right now. But what they're trying to do, spending time, possibly spending money, engaging in all kinds of elaborate, weird behaviors, they could have done at home in 10 minutes. And it seems like that's not a revelation, but it really is if you think about it. On top of my experiences, I observe so many men, strangers, but in particular friends and acquaintances, whose lives were absolutely ruined by the fact that they could not control their lust. We're talking about marriages that were ruined because the guys just needed more sexual variety, or alternatively, relationships that were ruined because the girl wasn't putting out enough. Hell, I even know stories where you have guys in marriages who father other children whilst technically being married to 2 people. All of this is born of lust. All of this is born of carnal desire, of sex. Sex can, in theory, be nice, but so much of it is simply destructive. Men, unfortunately, do think with their schlongs, and I have seen it destroy lives countless times. By my mid-30s, after thinking about it for a very long time, and probably psychologizing about it a bit too much, sex almost became dirty to me. Now, I'm not a conservative or anything like that, not really. But I do think there's some value in this old school thought that limits sex to the idea of procreation, because otherwise you just see so much destruction associated with it. Now, there's another element to sex as well, people don't think about, but it's kind of gross and disgusting. Now, hear me out. But here's the thing, in every other context, the bodily exchange of fluids between you and another person is viewed as absolutely disgusting. Imagine bathing in the urine of somebody else, or smearing yourself with somebody else's fecal matter, or feeling somebody's phlegm on your face, or their earwax. Do you want to be sneezed on by somebody else? You see, we have an aversion to other people's bodily fluids. We find it disgusting, frankly, and for good reason. Pathogens, dangerous, right? Now, sex, on account of STDs, as well as pregnancy, is still very dangerous. But in a certain context, the normal disgust we feel is shut off. Now, if we look at the female half of humanity, we can see that women find men that they're not attracted to, not just not attractive, but utterly disgusting in a sexual context. They're repulsed by such men. And this, of course, is related to the fact that they pay a higher price for engaging in sex compared to men. That is the ultimate cause, probably. But it is very telling. Men less so, but you can still be disgusted by somebody. So ultimately, you have to think of the type of hot wiring that's going off in your head as a person when you're engaging in the act of copulation. It is almost definitionally, in almost every biological context, disgusting to exchange bodily fluids. There's a high risk of pathogen infection, and yet your brain is forcing you to temporarily set aside those things. It's a very weird thing. Now, of course, people are just going to say I'm a loser for this and that, and I haven't had the most sex on planet Earth, by no means. But I have had my fair share. And some was okay, some of it was exceptional in the case of Kazanka Girl, and some of it was pretty decent. But the hijacking that sex leads to of the brain, especially as a male, is way too risky. So what I'm basically saying here is that it's possible to view sex in a different light. It is. Yes, you can constantly allow your monkey brain to take over and let that guide you. And it doesn't always have to lead to destruction, but it can very easily lead to destruction. And the question is, how do you benefit? Think about it as a male. What are you trying to achieve when you're just trying to boink? Are you trying to just get your rocks off? Are you trying to achieve a higher state of mind, body, and being? Something spiritual? Very unlikely. And yet, despite what I'm saying, sex makes the world go round. Not money, not power. It's all about the boinking, ultimately. We live in such a strange dichotomy to the act of boinking. We're so blind to it. We don't think about it. As I said, we don't realize that it's actually quite disgusting, all things considered. And yet, think about the benefits if we did think about sex strategically, and not just with our monkey brains. Think about it if men were actually not thinking with their schlongs for once. Because that would change the whole game. The leverage that women have over men, that is frequently used to manipulate men, and drive them to acts of total irrationality or even insanity in some cases, that would dissipate. So ultimately what I'm saying here is that beyond thinking about sex with your monkey brain, the desire simply to blow your load, there is a meta level you can think about sex with. I think once you start doing that, you realize that it's not all that it's cracked up to be. Anyway, as always, thank you for listening. Many special thanks to my patrons on Patreon. You guys are the best. You keep the channel alive and going. Without you, there is no Thinking-Ape. And many special thanks to my donors on PayPal. As for everybody else, if you can engage in the usual, like the video, share the video, comment, subscribe, be much appreciated. Until the next time, if I'm still alive, I'll check you out then. May the gods watch over you. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.